Hello, this is Simon Brew. I'm the editor of Film Stories magazine. I'm just waiting on an Amazon delivery. I'll start in a sec. Oh, hang on. Someone at the door. Let's see. Hello?
Please put down your weapon. You have 20 seconds to comply.
I only ordered USB chargers.
You now have 15 seconds to comply.
I might just...
You are in direct violation.
Oh, I might just start the podcast while I get onto customer service.
You now have 5 seconds to comply.
Oh, crikey. I'm going to roll the titles before it shoots me. Oh, my luck.
Come with me.
And I show you how deep the rabbit hole goes.
And movies that had stories.
That the story just sucks them in.
This is just the beginning.
Stories.
We would be honored if you would join us.
Hello, and a very warm welcome to the 250th episode of Film Stories with Simon Brew. I am Simon Brew. As always, that's absolutely everything you need to know about me. The aim of the podcast, though, well, the title gives it away. I'm here to talk of the stories of film, and I tend to talk about development stories, production stories, marketing stories, release stories, all those bits and bobs, really, that go to make the films that we know and sometimes love. Just that, the films that we know and sometimes love. The films I tend to cover on this podcast have more of a mainstream leaning to them than anything else. They're films I'm interested in or invested in to some degree. I try not to do snark. I try not to punch down. I'm here to celebrate cinema and the fact that films somehow manage to get made. The two films I've chosen for this episode of the podcast, one I like a lot more than the other, so I'm going to start with that one. I'm going to go all the way back to 1987 to a bona fide sci-fi classic. Let me play you a clip. I'll come to the story the other side of this.
Clarence Bodiger, you are under arrest. You have the right to remain silent. You.
Hey, wait a minute. Wait a minute! I'm protected, man. I've got protection.
You have the right to an attorney.
What is this shit? God damn it. God damn it! Listen to me. There's another guy. He's OCP. He's the senior president.
Anything you say may be used against you.
And that, of course, is a clip from 1987's RoboCop, directed by Paul Verhoeven, written by Edward Neumeier and Michael Miner, and starring Peter Weller, Nancy Allen, Ronnie Cox, Kurtwood Smith, Miguel Ferrer. And the story of this one, let's go all the way back to those writers, Edward Neumeier and Michael Miner. There were two initial parents to RoboCop who each brought slightly different ingredients to it. Now, neither originally knew the other, but Neumeier was working as an executive and story editor at Universal Pictures. He was already in the film industry, although he wasn't particularly enjoying his job at that point. Michael Miner, meanwhile, was at UCLA. He was at their film school. He was making student films. He was trying to break in. And Universal did an outreach program which involved sending its executives to UCLA and basically giving people a way into the industry. Now, this story is in part told in Callum Waddell's book, RoboCop, The Definitive History. And what happened was Neumeier and Miner became aware of each other, or more to the point, aware of each other's work. And as they gradually got to know each other, it turned out that Ed Neumeier was working in his spare time on a script for something called RoboCop, about a robot policeman. Now, Miner, meanwhile, was working on a script for Supercop, and this would have been about a police officer who was augmented with technology and effectively upgraded with all sorts of mechanics. And so they got talking and they saw obvious crossover in their ideas. And so in the autumn of 1984, the pair started pooling those ideas, that the two stories and the ideas therein would gradually become one. Now, Neumeier got basically a first act of his story in place, but there was a lot of ideas that were just being bandied around here. It said that Neumeier brought a satirical edge to the story. Miner brought a political one. For instance, there are segments in the completed film, some of the last things to be shot with RoboCop, jumping ahead a bit here, which involved the TV news channel media break. And that's a good example of where the pair particularly managed to find a way to meet in the middle, inspired to a degree by the classic movie Network there. Now, the two of them had full-time jobs and they were working nights and weekends around their other work at this stage. But it was by the end of 1984, they had a spec script ready. Now, a spec script, we've talked about this a lot of times on the podcast, is one written on spec, as it might sound, in that it's not been paid for by any Hollywood studio. And the idea is you sell a completed screenplay to a studio. You should, in theory, get slightly more money for that because the studio's not had to pay to develop it in the first place. But it doesn't always quite pan out like that. But as the pair would tell the Los Angeles Times, it said they said, we talked about the RoboCop project for 2.5 months and wrote it in about 2 months. By the end of December, they had something. Inevitable influences on it were Blade Runner. So Newmeyer was lucky enough to see some of the filming of Blade Runner. And it was on the set of that where he just had a light bulb moment and got this title in his head, RoboCop, and then started exploring just what that would be. The British comic 2000 AD, in particular the Judge Dredd strip, was obviously cited as well. In fact, one of the things that would delay the idea of a Judge Dredd movie, and we've had 2 so far that I've covered previously on this podcast, was the fact that RoboCop had effectively done this as well as any Dredd film could theoretically do. It was making the same points and it was telling a degree of the same story. So, with the script completed, how do you get something like that noticed? Well, one idea that Ed Newmeyer had was approaching a man called, do you remember this guy? Stan Lee, the comics legend. And the idea was, why not turn RoboCop into a comic book first and then use the profile of the comic book or just exploring the story visually to try and get a movie deal off the back of that? The problem was Lee had just seen a film that had come out backed by a company called Orion Pictures in 1984 called The Terminator and felt it was on similar ground and fearing it couldn't be topped. He passed on the RoboCop project. And in fact, The Terminator would cast a little bit of a shadow over some of those early conversations. Still, Newmeyer and Miner, they finished their script, they put it out to market in early 1985, and they went away on holiday for a few weeks and came back to a couple of offers. They got some tiny bites. Now, the first was a relatively complete deal from a film company called Atlantic Releasing that they would ultimately decline. But of more interest was a producer by the name of John Davison, who'd enjoyed some success with films like Airplane and Piranha, the latter directed by Joe Dante. And he'd offered a few $1,000s up front and a $25,000 fee for the pair to split for a rewrite. Now, that wasn't the kind of money where either of them, again, could quit their job. They didn't do so for quite some time, but they agreed to split that cash straight down the middle and decided to jump in with Davison. This proved to be a very, very wise move because here was a connected man. He was networked in and around the film industry. He knew people who could get this moving, not just above the line, but below the line as well. And also, he interested Orion Pictures. And so the Orion story is a very big one and lots of bumps and peaks and troughs, really, from Oscar winners like Silence of the Lambs and Dances with Wolves to bankruptcy just years after that. In the case of the mid-1980s, well, it had some successes. I mean, The Terminator was one, but also it put money into films like Francis Ford Coppola's The Cotton Club, and that hadn't done well at all. And it was going through one of its leaner periods at this point. And so the most it could offer up front to John Davison and to the RoboCop team was $10 million to make the film. Given the weight of effects that were going to be required to make it, this looked a daunting prospect, but $10 million is $10 million. And so Davison accepted. The project was signed up with Orion, and so it was then time to find a director. Now, the writers did have an in with a director by the name of Jonathan Kaplan, who would go on to make films like Unlawful Entry and Bad Girls, and he was an early candidate, but he wasn't interested really in this one. In fact, he would go on and make his own sci-fi film, Project X, just a couple of years afterwards. Names also in the mix for this one were David Cronenberg and Alex Cox, but Newmeyer and Miner have both seen a Dutch film from an upcoming director, Paul Verhoeven. He'd made all of his films in Holland at that point, but the film in question was Flesh and Blood, which was released in 1985, and Newmeyer and Miner went to see it at the cinema. There weren't that many people in the cinema to watch it, but they were hugely impressed by what they saw. And they also caught Soldier of Orange, an acclaimed film from Verhoeven's early catalogue, and so he was on the list. They arranged that the script should be sent to him. Verhoeven got that script, was on holiday, read a page of it, and promptly threw the thing in the bin, metaphorically. But also on holiday was Verhoeven's wife, Martine Tors, and while he went off for a swim, she picked up the screenplay and started leafing through it, in much the same way that Stephen King's first breakthrough book, Carrey, was saved when his wife fished it out the bin. So something similar was happening here. Because Verhoeven had only read a page or two of the script and really wasn't taken by what was in his words, the Americana of it. But she told him to take another look. Now, Verhoeven, English not being his first language, he didn't get all of the gags, but he did certainly see just that there was a lot more going on in this script than he'd first appreciated. He asked a lot of questions of it, but once he'd wrapped his head around it, he thought, I could do this. And so he rang Orion and asked that when he was in Los Angeles, could he meet up with them? Because at this stage, he was feeling his filmmaking opportunities in Holland were becoming limited. And so it was a bubbling thought in his head. Just go to America, sign the contract to make his first American film, make it this one, and just go for it. Because he'd seen a Jesus metaphor in the story, and he knew early on in his head that this needed to be a violent film, and he had a view of how it should be done. And Orion signed up, Davison signed up, and Paul Verhoeven was on board to make his first English language film. He was to be the director of RoboCop and would spark quite an American career with this particular film. Now, in terms of the casting, I mean, just go down the ensemble of this one. Kurtwood Smith, for instance. Now, he signed up originally when he got the script. He just thought this was going to be a relatively throwaway B-movie. And like many of the supporting roles in this, he was up for a couple of different parts. Would he like to be the chief of OCP, Dick Jones? Or what about the villain, Clarence Bodicker? And so he watched Paul Verhoeven movies ahead of his audition, and he realised once he saw them, actually, this could be really something special. And he leaned very much towards the character of Bodicker, one of the most iconic villains of 1980s cinema. Miguel Ferrer was another one who was just in for a different role. He was going to be a gang member. But he zeroed in on the role of Bob Morton instead and found that Verhoeven and his team were open to that, auditioned, duly landed the part. Also in the role of Lewis, well, Stephanie Zimbalist was cast in that particular role, but she would actually end up dropping out just 2 weeks before filming. Not unlike Pierce Brosnan with James Bond, she was stuck making the television drama Remington Steele and couldn't wriggle out of it, and so had to drop out of the film. And so one of the other people who'd auditioned for that role was the actor Nancy Allen. Now, she had starred across 3 Brian De Palma pictures. In fact, the pair would get married and subsequently divorce, but this really wasn't the kind of part that she was known for at this stage. Still, she really wanted it. She chased the role down, was disappointed when it went to Zimbalist in the first place, but when the call came in just a week or 2 before the start of filming, would she like to take this part on, she was still very much interested in the movie and signed on the dotted line. Another person cast against type actually was Ronnie Cox, who at this stage in his career was making far more wholesome characters, and here he was cast against that as the villainous corporate overlord Dick Jones. But then, who plays the dual lead role of Murphy and RoboCop, Alex Murphy? And so a couple of names were considered. I mean, Arnold Schwarzenegger was considered because Orion had this massive success with The Terminator with him in the lead role. Also, at this stage in his career, Schwarzenegger wasn't at his most expensive, but an offer never went into him because they just felt that he didn't have the everyman quality, really. And also, getting him into the tin costume was going to be something of a challenge for someone that tall. They needed someone a bit more, for want of a better way of putting it, normal. Now, Chuck Norris was also discussed, and Keith Carradine, his name was in the frame, but again, offers weren't going out. And it was a character actor by the name of Peter Weller, whose genre turn had been in the film The Adventures of Buckaroo Banzai Across the Eighth Dimension. Do you remember that one? And Weller was the person who moved into focus on this one, and he agreed to sign up, and they had their RoboCop. Now, John Davison's contacts book was very, very useful because more crucial personnel were hired. Phil Tippett behind the scenes, his work on the film's visual effects, it's legendary looking back now and pivotal to the success of the movie. There's Craig Hayes, who designed the Ed 209, who you heard right at the very, very start of this podcast. And then Rob Bottin was tasked with bringing RoboCop to life. And all of this involved a lot of prep, a lot of pre-production, a lot of building, a lot of physical work. And they knew, and this was on Bottin's shoulders really, that the film hinged on the suit working. That if they couldn't make the RoboCop suit believable, if they couldn't convince audiences that this could actually happen or work within the logic of the movie, they were scuppered before they started. So a lot of work was going on there. Incidentally, also going on, a British computer game company by the name of Ocean Software, who will be known to nerds of a certain age here in the UK, got hold of the script as it was wont to do in those days and savvily bought the computer game rights to the film for an absolute song. I'll come back to that story just shortly. Now, Paul Verhoeven, in an oral history of RoboCop to Esquire magazine, admits that they misread which way Rob Bottin was going with the RoboCop suit, and he said, we initially thought that Bottin's approach was just not sensational enough, and we started to criticise his design, which was already done. Now, this was going to have a knock-on to the production of the film, because he said Bottin, who is an extremely talented and sensitive artist, was given such false advice, the making of the suit was very difficult, and as Verhoeven would admit, it was now taking longer and longer to make the suit, and production on the film was looming. Verhoeven would concede all my ideas were absolutely wrong, and it took us weeks and weeks to accept that. We were essentially sabotaging the suit, so when we started shooting, the suit wasn't ready, and he says, I'll take full responsibility for Bottin being late with the suit. Because filming was looming in the summer of 1986, and they knew that the film was going to be set in Detroit. They wanted to lean in on the Motor City angle of that and the car trades and overhanging the entire environment of the film. But they couldn't afford to shoot it in Detroit. They would shoot the movie primarily in Dallas, and they would use some matte work to bring together the look of the futuristic Delta City as well. Davison would recruit in names from across the practical industry as well, puppets, stop frame animators, practical effects gurus. And with $10 million of Orion's money in place, filming could begin on August the 6th, 1986. Now, this is important because they filmed this in the summer. Now, I've not been to Dallas in the summer, but I'm reliably informed that it is very, very hot. And in this particular case, it was absolutely piping hot as well. That meant for a difficult production, and one of the people who wasn't there for much of it was Michael Miner, the co-writer of the film, who would spend a week or two on the set of the movie, but he'd been offered a job directing second unit on the movie, and he'd turned that down because he'd been interested in directing the whole film in the first place, and he was trying to build his own directorial career up, so instead would go on to helm the film Deadly Weapon instead, which came out in 1989. It'd been Monty Hellman who came in to do second unit work too, and there were reportedly tensions there that Verhoeven wasn't in the best of moods for large parts of the shoot. One person who certainly struggled during the filming of RoboCop was Peter Weller, because the RoboCop suit wasn't available right at the start, but that didn't affect the schedule, that they could do all the stuff with Weller in the character of Alex Murphy first. But the day it was delivered by Rob Bottin was the day that it was first needed for filming. And it took Weller, I've seen various accounts of this, and they say either 10 or 11 hours to be fitted into it for the first time. And Nancy Allen was one of those just sat in a trailer, fearing that it's either going to take 2 years to make the film or the whole thing's going to be shut down if it takes 10, 11 hours to get the main actor in the suit each time. Weller's first shot in the RoboCop outfit involved him simply trying to catch a set of car keys. It took an hour just to get that particular shot in the can as well. And also it became very clear to Weller that a lot of the preparation he'd done was about to be thrown out the window, because he'd worked with a mime coach for months ahead of production starting to try and perfect robotic movements. He figured if he was going to be covered up for a lot of the film, he had to bring some characterization through his movements in the suit, but it became clear that was a waste of time because he could barely move. In fact, the first few days, as he wore the suit and tried to get into the RoboCop element of the role, was incredibly taxing for Weller. Throw in a level of intense heat as well that would see him losing up to 8 pounds of weight a day. And let's just say it's one of the more taxing roles that I've covered during all the time I've been making this podcast. I mean, between takes, they would have to pump air hoses into the suit. They would have to rehydrate Weller. And then he would have to get up and do another scene. And getting out of the suit at any point during filming was just simply a no-go. At one stage as well, he was just struggling to hear as well. Having the helmet on, for instance, was tricky. So he would put a Walkman underneath and listen to music. Where he could, he would only wear half of the suit. We don't see some of that in the film, obviously. That would take it down a fruity angle. But it was just incredibly taxing. And with that, I think people were slightly more sympathetic to his request early on in filming that people refer to him, and this is Miguel Ferrer who reported this, as Robo or Murphy on the set, that he really wanted to get into the role. And so Kurtwood Smith, back in the RoboCop Definitive History book, would laugh, "I'm not going to call him anything like that." And according to Ferrer, Weller had instructed the producers to put a memo out to the cast and crew saying that no one should use his real name. But whenever I read interviews with the cast of RoboCop, they say they warmed to him quickly, that as much as that might have sounded quite an ego-y thing or a very method-y thing to do, it was very quick, it was very easy to break down, and there was quite a lot of camaraderie on a very, very difficult set. Now, the difficulties weren't necessarily coming from Orion, although the tightness of the budget was really quite something. And in fact, John Davison would praise how hands-off Orion was during the making of the film. But the director, Paul Verhoeven, well, he was quite a volatile character. So even though Peter Weller by the end of filming could be fitted into the robo suit in a matter of 3 hours, Verhoeven was still up against time. He was up against budget. In fact, as Kurtwood Smith would note, what Verhoeven was trying to do was make a whole film for the level of a single star salary just a few years later down the line. A very complex technical film as well. And there were moments, for instance, with the Ed 209 where they were just having to be ingenious about getting more of its screen time. And there's a point in the film where the Ed 209 just shuts down and you just get the hum of it in the background. And that was one of those ways that they were using mix of stop motion animation at that point and just sheer ingenuity that they could minimize the amount it needed to actually move and still keep it on screen for us to see. It was also noted that Verhoeven was said to have a short fuse, that he would get angry during the making of the film, and the tensions were very high. And by hook or by crook, on the 8th of November 1986, they finally got this one over the line and principal photography was done. Now, the movie would go back to Los Angeles for post-production and editing and 1 or 2 extra scenes as well. In fact, by this stage, Orion had done slightly better and had agreed to put in a little bit more money to cover that post-production work and also to buy in a score by the brilliant composer Basil Poledouris. And so the budget was creeping up to around $12-13 million at this stage. Now, Verhoeven in the edit was looking for really jarring cuts at certain points as well. In fact, as he would tell Esquire many years later, the one thing I felt very strongly about with the media break scenes, for instance, was that the transition between scenes should be an extremely abrupt break from the narrative. He said, you're taking the audience in another direction for a couple of minutes and then you're back to the narrative. I thought that should be very harsh. And so it was Frank J. Uriosti who edited the movie, and Verhoeven was vacuum packing this movie, also shifting the tone as and when he could. There were bits of extra filming as well done after principal photography. Peter Conn and Ed Neumeier would direct a couple of the adverts that we get in the film as well. And a couple of extra scenes were brought in just as the film was being shaped in the editing room. But it was in pretty decent shape. And so the idea now was all you needed to do was take this to the Motion Picture Association of America to get a rating. And then Orion planned to release this in the summer of 1987. Things sort of took a turn at this stage because Verhoeven, true to his original intent, had dialed the violence right up in this one. Blood and guts not in short supply. A man melting, being smashed down by a vehicle, not in short supply. And these really weren't things that the Motion Picture Association of America was known for particularly liking. He should have thrown in a song and dance number or something. That would have been a lot more wholesome. And so it didn't get the rating that Verhoeven and Orion and Davison needed. They needed the R certificate, and instead what the MPAA was coming back with was an X rating. So at this stage, the X, the forerunners to the NC-17 in America, meant that no child would be allowed to see RoboCop. Given how many of us watched it underage on video or DVD, that's quite something. But the X rating meant it wasn't going to play in cinemas. It wasn't going to get a wide video release. And whilst the film went backwards and forwards a lot of times as they tried to get the R rating they needed, it wasn't the 11 or 12 that was reported. Verhoeven said it was 8 in the end before they finally came up with a cut of the film that the MPAA would give an R rating for, and that would allow Orion to plan a wide release of the movie. Now, in subsequent interviews and analysis, Verhoeven argues that they got the R by cutting the violence back. And what he felt was that made it more shocking and less funny, that it had the reverse effect, having all the cuts in place that the MPAA needed to get the R rating. In fact, a director's cut has appeared and is widely available now that shows you just how long some of the violent scenes go on for, much longer than you get in the original cut of the movie. But RoboCop was pretty much ready for release. Now, meanwhile, alongside this, Ocean Software was developing its game based on the film, which it wouldn't have in time for the cinema release, but it would have in time to capitalise on the success of the movie. Because RoboCop, when it arrived in front of critics, well, straight away, eyebrows were raised that there was something in this that people were warming to. Now, inevitably, not all critics liked this, but on the whole, more people than you might think got it at the time than didn't. That the dark comedy in there, the satire was really picked up on, and the reviews were strong. There was pushback over the violence of the film, as you probably could have guessed, and not everyone particularly wrapped their head around it. But still, RoboCop went into its release weekend in the US on July the 17th to the 19th, 1987, off the back of some good notices in the papers. And it was going up against some unlikely competition as well. Because the big new release, I love this, that RoboCop went up against on its opening weekend was Disney's re-release of Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs. How perfect is that? Also out the same week, Universal has scheduled Jaws: The Revenge, the film that Michael Caine infamously would say that he never saw, but he saw the house that it paid for. And RoboCop opened on over 1,500 screens with an $8 million opening weekend. Now, this was a good, solid surprise hit. In the scheme of things, the film had cost 12-13 million to make. It had good word of mouth, and it would hang around in the charts for a good few weeks as well. Now, it's not as if there wasn't competition around. Superman 4 would arrive the week after, and things were expected of that until people actually saw it. The Bond film The Living Daylights, The Lost Boys, they were out a couple of weeks later. But RoboCop was still hanging around in the top 10 a month later, even as movies such as No Way Out were about, La Bamba, Stakeout, Masters of the Universe. And by the time it had completed its cinema run in the US, it had picked up a princely sum of $53 million. This was absolute music to Orion's Excel spreadsheet at the time, although it probably wasn't Excel if we're getting spreadsheet nerdy. I'm not, don't worry. But it was a profitable film, and Orion would quickly want a sequel to it. Now, I've covered RoboCop 2 and 3 and the 2014 new take on RoboCop in previous episodes of this podcast, but it's interesting that this was the only RoboCop film made to date that came with zero expectations and thus zero studio interference. And you don't need me to tell you just how its reputation has grown and grown and grown and grown over time, and it is regarded entirely justly as an absolute classic of its time. Now, for Ocean Software, meanwhile, it got the game out and managed to get a trailer for it on the video release in the UK of RoboCop. That original video was notable for you having to wind through 30 minutes of adverts to get to the film. However, Ocean transformed its business off the back of RoboCop's success, which made it an international player in computer and video games at that stage. And it would be fair to say that Ocean never got quite as good and cheap a deal ever again off the back of it, but nonetheless, it had made a lot of money by that stage. Now, RoboCop's legacy continues beyond the film sequels as well. There's a television series called Prime Directives that followed. There's a new television series reportedly in development as well. There's a documentary feature about the making of the film that seems to have been in production for an awful long time as well. That was being crowdfunded and might get released in the next year or two. But crucially, RoboCop is a film that managed to get through the system of a small Hollywood studio, granted, but also crucially managed to do so with all its rough edges not shaved off before it was released. You can see the other version of the film widely available on physical media now. I've got to say though, the cinematic release, the cinema version, is hardly shabby either, is it? An absolute flat-out classic. Which brings me to the halfway point of this latest episode of Film Stories. As always, thank you for your time. Thank you for listening. I'm just going to do some parish notices before I crack on with the second of the two movies. And it's a film I like a lot less. Firstly then, if you like this podcast and want to support it, thank you so much. There are 3 ways you can do so. You can go to patreon.com/Simon Brew, and if you financially support us there, it helps pay for all the research materials for the podcast. It lets me pay writers to give writers a break, writing for our website as well and giving them a way into the industry. You get in exchange the podcast, virtually all of them arrive early. There's a few extra bits and bobs in there too, as well as the gossip behind the scenes. I try to do a post on that every week as well. That's patreon.com/Simon Brew. A thank you to everyone who supports me there. If you can subscribe to this podcast at your podcast home of choice, that helps enormously too. And if you can leave ideally a hugely positive review, it's things like that that have got me this far, and I'm forever grateful for it. If I can also just quickly alert you to the fact that the new issue of Film Stories print magazine is shipping now with the brilliant Doug Jones on the front cover, a proper movie nerd interview. You can find that at store.filmstories.co.uk. We ship that all over the world. But now I'm going to move on to the second of the two films I'm talking about in this 250th episode of Film Stories. It feels really weird saying that. This one's a sequel, a not great sequel, but we're going back to the mid-1990s because there's quite a story behind it. Let me play you a clip and I'll come to the story the other side of this.
In the deepest jungles of Africa, 2 tribes will fight a savage war unless a sacred animal god is found. So they're sending for the only man who can help. Jim Carrey is Ace Ventura, pet detective. Now,
Perhaps we should slow down.
Nonsense, poopy pants!
he will embark on a delicate mission to help a people untouched by civilization.
They did not know about disease until the white man came. I am fighting something.
Blind to fear and immune to pain.
Throw it! I dare you!
So there you go. Whenever my kids ask me what were films like in 1995, I play them a clip from the trailer from Ace Ventura, When Nature Calls. Directed and written by Steve Odekirk, based on characters by Jack Bernstein, and starring Jim Carrey, Ian McNeice, Simon Callow, Maynard Eziashi and Bob Gunton. Now, the film, of course, was a sequel to 1994's Ace Ventura, Pet Detective, the movie that put Jim Carrey on the map as a movie star. Because, I mean, at this stage, comedy sequels weren't always a surefire thing at the box office, but off the back of this incredible breakthrough trio of films, Ace Ventura, Pet Detective first, then The Mask the following summer, then Dumb and Dumber at the end of that year, Jim Carrey had become the most in-demand actor in the world. His price was skyrocketing. He was recruited to star in Batman Forever as the Riddler when Robin Williams, long assumed to be the incumbent for that role, just wasn't sure and wasn't committing to the part. And then there was this. He had a money almost no object sequel to deal with, and that would be Ace Ventura, Pet Detective 2. Because as part of his deal for the first Ace Ventura film, the production company behind it, Morgan Creek, had savvily inserted a sequel clause. And thus, when Ace Ventura Pet Detective became a hugely profitable breakout hit, it activated its clause, it wanted a sequel, and it was going to want it quickly. Now, Jim Carrey was in a position to negotiate a good deal, and here's where his friend Steve Odekirk, who was listed as a creative consultant on the first movie, came in particularly useful, in that he suggested to Carrey that he asked Morgan Creek for a lot more money, $15 million in this case, and Morgan Creek, knowing it had the hottest new movie star in the world on its hands and a contract for him, an obligation for him to make a film for the studio, agreed to pay up. Carrey suddenly had gone from zero to a $15 million actor inside little under 2 years, really. Now, what I found when exploring this particular story is there's a sort of parallel between the official telling in all the press notes for Ace Ventura When Nature Calls and what seemed to be going on. So across this bit of the podcast, I'll present both sides of it to you, because according to the press notes, both Jim Carrey and Steve Odekirk, and Odekirk was going to come in and write this one, they had very specific ideas about the sequel. As Odekirk is quoted as saying, "We thought, why even do it if we're not trying to do something staggeringly bigger and better and funnier?" Which sort of flies a bit in the face of the fact that Morgan Creek had a sequel option on Carrey for the movie, but still Odekirk insisted that was the goal, first with the script and then with the movie. And so the idea of moving the character of Ace Ventura overseas to Africa came from Jim Carrey, and as Odekirk again said, it meshed beautifully with my idea of a totally different movie. He said we didn't want to make the same movie over again with the same setting, the same supporting characters, and just a different animal missing, he says, which is effectively the plot of the first film. And Carrey said, "I've always been fascinated with Africa. I've always wanted to go there. They wouldn't film in Africa. I'm coming to that." And he said it's the quintessential Ace place where he'd want to be and where he'd probably end up with all his animal pals. It was a logical step for him. And so Carrey also wanted to go international with the second Ace Ventura movie. And he said something happened in the first one, which was kind of cool. There was like a Bondian aspect to Ace, like Agent 007. So I sort of saw the sequel in the vein of a James Bond film. Now, the man who had directed the first Ace Ventura film was Tom Shadyac, and he would get a career boost and a half as well. That would be the launch of his Hollywood directing career. He would go on to work with Carrey again on films like Liar Liar and Bruce Almighty, for instance. So there's no real problem between the pair of them. But in this particular case, he didn't want to return for the Ace Ventura sequel because he was committed and more interested in making the remake of The Nutty Professor with Eddie Murphy in the lead role. It would prove to be a commercially very savvy choice for him. And so when he took that job, Ace Ventura needed a new director, and this was a gift that was Carrey's to give, because as part of the contract he'd negotiated, as well as $15 million, he had other movie star stuff written in there as well, such as, well, he could choose who was going to direct the film. And the choice was a first-timer, a man called Tom DiCerchio, and he was hired to direct. It was going to be his directorial debut. Carrey had got control over that choice, and to be fair, if Carrey had wanted to yodel on screen for 90 minutes, I get the sense with this particular movie that Morgan Creek would have signed the cheque and banked the money the other side. Now, in more recent times, it's emerged that Spike Jonze, he of Being John Malkovich, for instance, and Her, was a possible candidate to direct at this stage. It was some time before he come to Being John Malkovich, but he was still rising off the back of his music video work, and Jonze pitched for the job, but as Carrey would reflect at the Toronto International Film Festival more than 20 years later, he said, "I was stupid enough to turn him down to direct Ace 2 because I had no idea who he was, and he came in and pitched all kinds of, what does that say? Flit? I don't know, handwriting. And he was about to take over the world and I didn't know it. I was like, I don't know, this guy's new, and I've been kicking myself ever since." Also identified as possible candidates to direct Ace Ventura 2 were the Farrelly brothers, who'd directed Dumb and Dumber starring Carrey, and they were sounded out about it. But at this particular point in their life, they were preparing the movie Kingpin, and they figured they weren't really the right people to do Ace Ventura. And so the project was pressing forward with Tom DiCerchio behind the camera. It was also coming together quickly. This was a very hastily put together sequel. Carrey's old writing friend, Steve Odekirk, was writing the screenplay, and Carrey did have some issues with it. I mean, he'd talk about these a bit later through one of his co-stars, Jeff Daniels, about, for instance, did he want the character of Ace Ventura in this to fear bats, for instance? Was going to Africa, were the people of Africa being fairly represented? Well, no matter with all of this, because on the film went that Carrey had this gap in his schedule to get it made, and the plan was get the movie up and running before cameras by the spring of 1995, with Morgan Creek wanting to capitalise on the popularity of Jim Carrey with a Christmas 1995 release. By this point, Batman Forever would have been released as well, and the thinking was his star would be shining even brighter. But it would be wrong to say that Morgan Creek planned this as a massively expensive production, because the budget infamously of Ace Ventura When Nature Calls, which is what the film would go on to be called, was $30 million. Half of that was going to Jim Carrey, and so effectively what everyone else was left with was the making of a low-budget film. $15 million to make a Hollywood movie that involved travelling to other continents was not a lot of money at all, and it was one that they had to somehow take the audience to exotic locales on, and spoiler, they didn't really. Still, in terms of the casting, Georgiana Robertson, Ian McNeice, Simon Callow were cast in supporting roles. They were looking at one stage for classically trained British actors here. It's worth noting that Robertson wouldn't get past rehearsals before she was ultimately released from the movie, but the film just moved forward with a start of production date of the 27th of March 1995. It was going to be in cinemas less than 9 months later, and it didn't leave America for its filming. Because whilst the settings for the movie called for Himalayan mountaintops, dense forest, all sorts of terrains, the logistics were such that the filmmakers decided to stay within the confines of the United States and Canada. And so they picked areas of the country: San Antonio, Texas, South Carolina, Charleston. The primary sites were identified there for the African setting of the movie, and then they went to Canada. They went to Vancouver for the Himalayan sequences in the film. They also, when they were in Texas, got hold of a 15,000-acre ranch which had lots of open spaces and lots of animals that they could use, because the whole conceit of Ace Ventura: Pet Detective is it involves animals. He is Ace Ventura, there are pets. He must detect them, and they decided they were going to need an awful lot more animals in this movie. Now, this is where Kathy Morrison came in, who was running a company called Birds and Animals Unlimited, and it was her job to provide the animals for the film, to train the animals for the film. They were using 5 times as many animals as they had with Ace Ventura: Pet Detective. Only one of the original animals returned for this one. They were also looking for animals that were specific to the African setting of the movie: giraffes, elephants, zebras, lions, water buffalo. They used 3 different types of antelope. I mean, who knew? Ostriches, chimpanzees, a baboon in there, a mix of birds. And as Morrison would say to the official press notes of the movie, the animals in the first film had to fill an apartment. In Ace Ventura: When Nature Calls, they had to fill Africa. This, when production began, though, would soon become a very troubled film, and problems mounted very early on. I mean, the late casting change hadn't helped, but also the first-time director here was struggling a lot. And it was Premiere magazine that reported just how quickly Jim Carrey got quite hands-on with the film, that he would be working on scenes and doing jobs you would expect the director to do. Now, it's worth noting that the original director of Ace Ventura: When Nature Calls has not had his say on this, so I can't reflect his side of this. But the story that was reported by Premiere was that Carrey was reblocking scenes. He was looking at footage at the end of the day and was not happy with what he was watching. And one person who was particularly candid about his experience on the movie was Simon Callow, who wrote about it quite a lot in his memoir called Shooting the Actor. And he said how he arrived on set and it didn't take him long at all to work out that all was not right. He would quickly observe, to quote him, that Jim Carrey was, quote, at war with the director and the producers. And after a few days of filming, Callow had to take a quick trip back home to England. And when he returned to the American set of the movie, things had changed, because Carrey had decided that Tom Churchio had to go and a new director was coming in. And in this case, he asked his old friend Steve Oderkirk to come in and take over as the director of the movie. Now, Oderkirk agreed to this, and Morgan Creek wasn't going to argue with its star. It was very, very clear where it was putting its money, after all. And what was said to have happened here was that Carrey and Oderkirk would just go away for a weekend and they would work out what was going wrong with the film, how to fix it, how to get things back on track. Now, in the backdrop of this, Carrey had been working relentlessly for several years, and his health was not in great shape, to the point where he was needing sick days away from filming and wasn't able to shoot every day he was originally scheduled to do so. The film would start to slip behind schedule, and the delays would mount up and have a knock-on effect for everyone else. And as Simon Callow said, Jim Carrey believed, this is a quote, rightly or wrongly, that having paid him a sum of money beyond computation to make this sequel, they were stinting on everything else: props, studio, time. And he said the atmosphere was somewhat strained. Jim was often ill. He said we shot reaction shots to scenes we'd never played, and whenever Jim returned, he was possessed of a manic comic energy many times beyond what you see on the screen. New York magazine would go further and suggest that effectively Carrey was sort of directing the movie. As one unnamed actor was quoted as saying, he's calling the shots. Now, what it actually sounded like was that Steve Odekirk and Jim Carrey were working together on it. Odekirk was directing the film, but if Carrey was asking for another shot, another take of something, he duly got it. But it just fed to the narrative of this was a troubled film. Here was a big new Hollywood movie star. He was pushed, he was stomping around his way. All those cliches, really. But he was ill. And during the filming of the movie, he was taking quite a few days, to the point where the impact on his co-stars wasn't just in terms of the delay in being released from filming. It also managed to hit them in the pocket, because Morgan Creek allegedly argued that this was regarded as an act of God under contract terms, that the lead actor was ill and unable to work, and as such the supporting cast were given no more funds for their trouble and for their extra time. Simon Callow had commitments back home and in Europe, and he realised eventually that his flights home were being deducted directly from his salary. The production wasn't paying for them, even though the fact that he was flying back, well, under the original schedule, it just wouldn't have been a problem at all. So the film, he would calculate in the end, would actually cost him money to make. But it would finally get over the line. I mean, it took about as long to film as like a middling Marvel movie, that it finished shooting on the 28th of July 1995, and it motored into post-production because there was a very, very tight deadline for this one to hit. That Morgan Creek, through Warner Brothers, was putting this one out on November the 10th, 1995. It was going to premiere it a couple of days before, and so there was barely a couple of months to get the film into some kind of shape. You can pretty much guess what happened when it ultimately ended up in front of critics as well. I mean, the law of diminishing returns was cited an awful lot of times, and critics who were hardly banging the drum for the first movie, well, the knives were very much out for the second one. The reviews were pretty poor, but at this stage, it just mattered not. Ace Ventura: When Nature Calls was delivering more of what the first film had done, including a birthing scene that saw Carrey crawl out of, an animal's regions. I think we can say that. But critics be damned, box office went nuts. The film that had cost $30 million to make opened at number one spot November the 10th to the 12th, 1995 in the US, with a staggering $37.8 million in its opening 3 days. And this was the law of the comedy sequel being ripped up before our eyes. All of a sudden, comedy sequels could make lots of money. And so as much as it's not a very liked film, it was a pretty important one in the scheme of where Hollywood's bean counters would be looking for their next big hit. It outgrossed the second place film that week, the terrific Get Shorty, by some $30 million. And other films that were around that week were Copycat, which I've covered before, Powder, Home for the Holidays, Fair Game. Seven had been around for a couple of months, Eddie Murphy and Vampire in Brooklyn. And in terms of new releases, Carrington was out, starring Emma Thompson. That was just beginning its award run there. But everyone else had pretty much given Jim Carrey a wide berth. The following week, it would be knocked down to second spot when Goldeneye arrived and The American President turned up too. But even so, it was making good, solid box office cash and would hang around the top of the chart for quite a while, on its way to an American gross of $108 million. That was a significant upgrade on the $72 million the first film had made in the States, and Morgan Creek would feel pretty justified with all the decisions and, let's just say, the scrimping and saving it made on the movie. Its total gross around the world, once everything was factored in, would come in at $212 million. Again, that was more than double the take of the original film. That said, there are a little bit of afters on this one, in that it seems pretty clear that Jim Carrey didn't enjoy making it. In fact, this would be the film that would put him off sequels for the vast bulk of his career. So he'd just come off Batman Forever, which wasn't technically his sequel, but it would take a long, long time for him to make a direct follow-up to one of his other movies, and not for the want of being asked either. It would be Dumb and Dumber 2, and I think in hindsight he probably regrets making Dumb and Dumber 2 as well. More recently he's done Sonic the Hedgehog 2, but he's the supporting role in that, and Kick-Ass 2, I mean, that's a whole story in itself, which I will come to in a future episode of the podcast, where he agreed to sign up for the sequel and all but denounced the movie before it was released over its levels of violence. But for the purposes of this particular story and this particular Pet Detective, When Nature Calls is a film that he'd ultimately admit he regretted making, that he felt he did it because he had to do it, that he was contractually obliged to do it, and it was one with a lot of behind-the-scenes troubles on its way to the screen. Now, Morgan Creek was very happy with the box office returns, and was asking Jim Carrey for an Ace Ventura 3, but at this stage Carrey was definitely out. There was no way he was returning. It didn't stop the question going in every few years, but it just wasn't going to happen. In fact, it's only recently that it's come up as a possible, where it was revealed that Patrick Casey and Josh Miller, who'd penned the 2020 Sonic the Hedgehog film, were writing an Ace Ventura 3. But even then, there's precious little sign that Jim Carrey wants to do it, and if it does move ahead at Morgan Creek, then it's likely that we'll be seeing another actor in the role of Ace Ventura. It was not a happy time, but what I want to do is contrast all this with the gloss that was put in the official press notes that were put out around the time of the movie. Now, appreciating that press notes are hardly like to say this one was an absolute sod to make and we couldn't wait to be shot of it, there was some degree of reversal of, I'm loath to say reversal of truth, but certainly let's just say being creative, when I found this sentence: when producer James G. Robinson, chairman and CEO of Morgan Creek Productions, approached Carrey about a sequel, Carrey was glad to don the signature Hawaiian shirts, an upswept hairstyle, and once again breathe life into Ace. I find no evidence whatsoever that he was. Still, let's listen to what Carrey said. I love that guy, he said. I love the character. I love the do. Ace embodies absolute enjoyment of life. He has no respect for authority. Basically, he's like a child. He always seems to be playing and having a good time at whatever he does. As Steve Odekirk would chip in, Ace is totally irreverent, and that's why kids love him so much. Ace respects no one. He's a completely good guy, but he has absolutely no respect for normal conventions. What he also doesn't have respect for is the sign of any Ace Ventura 3 with Jim Carrey involved, but I should note that Steve Odekirk has gone on to build a far better career than I've had as well. Carrey continues to work, even though he's talking about retiring and backing away from making films. And as for Morgan Creek, you just get the impression, by hook or by crook, he's going to find some way to get another Ace Ventura movie out into the world. And that brings me to the end of episode 250 of the Film Stories podcast. So if I've not completely bored you, you can find more from me on Twitter at Simon Brew. You can find more from the entire Film Stories project at Film Stories Pod. At our website, filmstories.co.uk, you can find movie news, reviews, features, all sorts of mayhem there. If you go to store.filmstories.co.uk, that's where you can get our print magazines. There are lots and lots of them. The current issue of our monthly magazine has Doug Jones on the front cover, a proper movie nerd interview with him. I have more live shows coming up. I am in London this week as this is being released on June the 23rd. You can find more on that at filmstories.co.uk. And then I head back to Birmingham for my Movie Geek live show there, July the 13th, 2022. Again, head to the website to find more there. You can find us on Facebook at facebook.com/filmstoriesonline as well, and youtube.com/filmstories. I'm also trying to work out how TikTok works, but that's a bit of an adventure. For now, I just want to say thank you so much for everyone who's supported me and this podcast over our 250 episodes. I'm going to go away now and start working on episode 251. Thank you very much for everything. Thank you for your support. You all stay well. You all stay safe. Going to be back soon with some more film stories. Bye-bye.
I'd buy that for $1.